Working the night shift at McDonald's was never supposed to be exciting. Sure, you'd get the occasional rowdy group of teenagers or the late-night trucker passing through, but most nights were pretty uneventful. That's why I was caught off guard when I found myself standing alone in the kitchen, staring at the drive-thru monitor, wondering if I was about to lose my mind. It was Halloween night, just after midnight, and the place was dead, no pun intended. The dining area was empty, the usual hum of customers replaced by the low buzz of the overhead lights. My coworker, Dan, had just stepped out for a smoke, leaving me to cover the front counter and drive-thru. I was scrolling through my phone when the drive-thru bell chimed, signaling a car had just pulled up to the order box. I glanced at the monitor and saw an old, beat-up van idling there, its headlights barely cutting through the fog that had rolled in off the highway. "Welcome to McDonald's. Can I take your order?" I asked, my voice echoing through the empty restaurant. For a few seconds, there was nothing but static from the speaker. I was about to repeat myself when a voice crackled through, low and almost inaudible. "Just a moment, please," the voice said. Something about it made my skin crawl. It wasn't the words themselves, but the tone, flat, emotionless, almost mechanical. I shook off the feeling, telling myself I was just jumpy from the Halloween atmosphere. "Sure, take your time," I replied, trying to sound casual. I watched the monitor, expecting to see the van's taillights as it drove away, but it just sat there, idling in the fog. The seconds ticked by, and I felt a growing unease. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the voice came back, clearer this time, but still unnerving. "I'll have a Big Mac, fries, and a Coke." "Okay, that'll be $6.99 at the first window," I said, my hand hovering over the cash register, waiting for the van to pull forward. But it didn't move. It just sat there, the static on the speaker growing louder, almost like heavy breathing. "Sir," I prompted, leaning closer to the microphone. "Please pull forward to the first window." There was no response, just the crackling of the speaker. I glanced at the monitor again, but the fog was thicker now, obscuring the view. All I could see were the faint outlines of the van's headlights. My heart started to race. I couldn't explain it, but something felt horribly wrong. I was about to grab the headset and call Dan back inside when the van suddenly lurched forward, coming to a stop at the first window. I forced a smile, trying to steady my nerves, and walked over to the window. As I slid it open, a blast of cold, damp air hit me. The van was there, engine rumbling, but the driver's seat was empty. I blinked, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The van was running, but there was no one inside. No driver, no passenger, just an empty seat. "Hello?" I called out, leaning slightly out the window to get a better look. "Is anyone there?" That's when I saw it, something moving in the back of the van, just a shadow at first, but then it shifted closer to the front. I could barely make out a figure, hunched over, crawling slowly toward the driver's seat. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to close the window, to walk away, but I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on the figure. It reached the driver's seat and slowly, deliberately, turned its head to look at me. I wish I could describe what I saw, but my mind refuses to fully recall it. The face, it wasn't right. It was human, but not. The eyes were too large, the mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. It looked at me for what felt like an eternity, those eyes boring into mine, before it finally spoke. "Thank you," it said, the same flat, mechanical voice from the speaker. I slammed the window shut and stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I ran to the back door and threw it open, shouting for Dan. He came running, a look of concern on his face. "Man, what's wrong?" he asked, but I couldn't find the words. I just pointed to the drive-through window, trying to catch my breath. Dan walked over, peered out the window, then turned back to me, his face pale. "There's no one there," he said, his voice shaking. The van's gone. I rushed over to the window and looked out, but he was right. The van was gone, the fog slowly lifting to reveal an empty parking lot. I ran outside, searching the lot and the road beyond, but there was nothing. No taillights, no sound of an engine, just the stillness of the night. We checked the security cameras, but the footage was nothing but static from the moment the van pulled up until the moment it disappeared. It was like it had never been there at all. I quit my job the next day. I didn't tell anyone the real reason. I just said the night shifts were getting to me. But the truth is, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that van was still out there. And every Halloween night since, I can't help but look over my shoulder, expecting to see those twisted eyes staring back at me, that mechanical voice whispering in the dark. The Navy had always been my life. 10 years in the service, 3 deployments, and countless hours at sea. I thought I'd seen it all, until that night. It was October 31st, the night that would forever haunt my memories. We were on a classified mission in the Pacific, a part of the world where maps go blank and communication signals fade into nothingness. Our orders were clear: monitor an area of suspicious underwater activity. It was just another night for most of the crew, but the tension was tense. Something was off. I was stationed in the sonar room, the heart of our operation. It's where we detect anything moving beneath the surface, from enemy submarines to schools of fish. That night, the screen showed nothing unusual, just the familiar hum of the ocean's depths. But then, just after midnight, the hum changed. A low-frequency sound, something deep and rhythmic, started pulsing through the speakers. It wasn't mechanical, not like the noise of another submarine or a ship passing overhead. It felt alive. "Captain, you might want to hear this," I called out, my voice shaky despite myself. He stepped in, listening to the sound with a concerned look. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, more to himself than to me. We spent the next few hours trying to figure it out. The sound grew louder, more intense, until it felt like it was inside my skull, not just my ears. It was driving us mad. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more strange. We thought it was over, just some strange underwater phenomenon. But then the screens lit up. Lips everywhere, moving fast, circling us. It looked like we were surrounded by something. But there was nothing out there, nothing our eyes could see. Just endless, empty water. "Surface," the captain ordered, a rare tremor in his voice. But when we tried, the sub wouldn't respond. The controls were dead, like something had taken hold of the ship. We were trapped, hundreds of feet below the surface, with no way out. Panic set in among the crew. We're trained to stay calm in emergencies, but this was different. There was a fear in the air, something strange. Men who had faced enemy fire without flinching were now huddled together, whispering prayers under their breath. Then, the lights started to flicker. A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the hull, as if something massive was scraping against us from the outside. It was a sound that no man-made object could make, a sound of raw power and intent. Suddenly, the sub lurched, throwing us against the walls. The hull groaned under the pressure, and I could feel it, a deep vibration in my bones, like the whole world was trembling. The screens went dark, and in that moment, every rational thought left my mind. All I knew was that we were not alone. For what felt like hours, we were tossed around, unable to regain control. It was like the ocean itself had come alive, trying to crush us from all sides. And then, just as abruptly as it began, it stopped. The sub righted itself, the lights stabilized, and the controls came back online. We surfaced immediately, bursting through the waves into the cold night air. The crew scrambled out onto the deck, gasping for breath, desperate for the sight of the stars. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. The night sky was empty. No stars, no moon, just a black void stretching endlessly above us. And in the distance, just barely visible, was land. But not any land we recognized. There were no charts for this place, no records of an island in these coordinates. We were stranded, with no way to contact the outside world. The radio was dead, and the compasses spun wildly, refusing to settle. The captain ordered us to disembark, to explore this mysterious island, but I refused. Something deep inside me screamed to stay aboard the sub. Those who stepped onto the island never returned. Hours passed, then days, and no one came back. We were alone. Then, one by one, the men started to disappear. It was always in the dead of night. We'd hear a splash, and by the time we reached the deck, there was nothing, no sign of struggle, no trace of the missing crew. Just the silent, endless sea. I was the last one left, clinging to the hope that somehow, someone would find us. But I knew, deep down, that we were lost. Lost in a place where no one was meant to go, where the rules of nature didn't apply. On the seventh night, I heard the sound again. That same deep, rhythmic pulse echoing through the hull. It was louder now, closer, as if it was coming from inside the sub itself. And then, in the darkness, I saw them, shapes, moving in the shadows, too fast to track, too silent to be human. They were watching me, waiting. I don't know what they wanted or why they chose us. All I knew was that it was my turn. I'm sending this message in the hopes that someone, somewhere, will hear it and understand. If you find this sub, if you find this recording, leave. Leave and never look back. Some things are not meant to be found. Some places should remain lost. The ocean is vast and deep, and we are not alone. And if you listen closely, on the darkest of nights, you might hear it too, the sound beneath the silent waves. It was supposed to be just another Halloween, nothing out of the ordinary. I was running late, which wasn't unusual for me, but this time it felt different, like every minute ticking by was winding a tighter knot in my gut. I had promised my younger sister I'd be back in time to take her trick-or-treating, but work ran late, and by the time I left, the sun was already sinking below the horizon. I decided to take a shortcut through the old railroad tracks to get home faster. It was a route I hadn't taken in years, mostly because the tracks had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. Overgrown with weeds and surrounded by woods on both sides, it wasn't the kind of place you'd normally choose to walk through, especially not alone. But I was in a rush, and it was the quickest way back. As I entered the path, the air grew colder, and the sounds of the neighborhood, kids laughing, leaves crunching underfoot, faded away, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The railroad tracks stretched out ahead of me, rusted and forgotten, barely visible in the dim light. The trees on either side loomed like dark sentinels, their branches reaching out as if to snatch at anyone foolish enough to pass through. I walked quickly, my footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. The tracks were uneven, making me stumble every few steps, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. But there was no one there. Just the empty path and the whispering wind. Halfway through, I noticed something up ahead, a small, makeshift campsite off to the side of the tracks, hidden among the trees. It wasn't much, just a few old blankets, a rusted metal bucket, and what looked like an abandoned backpack. But what caught my eye was the fire pit in the center, still smoldering faintly, as if someone had been there recently. I hesitated, my instinct screaming at me to keep moving, to ignore it and just get home. But curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, peering into the darkness around the campsite. There was no sign of anyone, no movement, no sound. But as I bent down to examine the backpack, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Scattered around the fire pit were dozens of Polaroid photos, half buried in the dirt. I picked one up, brushing off the dust, and felt my heart skip a beat. The photo was of a young woman, probably in her 20s, standing right where I was. Her expression was blank, almost vacant, and there was something off about the way she was positioned, like she had been posed. I picked up another photo, then another. Each one showed a different person, some young, some older, standing alone at this very spot. All of them had the same vacant expression, the same unnatural pose, and all of them were taken at night, with the tracks and trees looming in the background. I felt a wave of nausea as I realized what I was looking at. These weren't just random photos. They were staged, deliberate, and whoever had taken them had been standing right where I was now. My heart pounded in my chest as I dropped the photos and backed away from the campsite. I needed to get out of there, fast. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a figure standing further down the tracks, just at the edge of the trees. It was barely visible in the fading light, but I could make out the silhouette of a man, tall and thin, watching me. Panic surged through me, and I started running, not caring about the uneven ground or the fact that I could barely see where I was going. I just needed to get away. I could hear my own breath, ragged and panicked, and the sound of my footsteps pounding against the tracks. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally reached the end of the tracks and stumbled out onto the street, I was gasping for air, my heart racing. I looked back, half expecting to see the man standing there, but there was nothing, just the darkened path and the distant rustle of the trees. I made it home, breathless and trembling, just as my sister was heading out the door with her friends. I told her I wasn't feeling well, that I needed to lie down. She looked disappointed, but she didn't press me. As soon as she left, I locked all the doors and windows, something I'd never bothered to do before. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photos, the blank expressions, the unnatural poses, and that figure in the distance, watching. I kept telling myself it was just some twisted prank, that there was no real danger. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it, something I couldn't explain. I never took that shortcut again. I made sure to be home before dark, avoiding the tracks at all costs. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those photos, and I wonder who those people were, if they ever made it out of those woods. And I wonder if one day, someone will find a photo of me, standing alone on those tracks, with that same vacant expression, captured by a camera held by someone or something that I never saw coming. It was Halloween night, and the excitement in the air was contagious. My small town had always taken Halloween seriously, houses decked out with elaborate decorations, kids in creative costumes, and parents trailing behind, making sure no one got lost in the crowd. But that night, I wasn't just another trick-or-treater. I was a high school senior, and for the first time, I was left in charge of taking my little brother, Max, out on his candy run. Max was 8, and like every kid, he was obsessed with candy. We planned our route meticulously, knowing which houses gave out the best treats and which ones to avoid. We hit the usual spots, filling up his pumpkin-shaped bucket with chocolates, gummies, and the occasional full-sized candy bar. Everything was going as planned until we reached the last house. It was an old, narrow Victorian at the end of a cul-de-sac, the kind of place kids usually whispered about but never dared to visit. The house was dark except for a single flickering jack-o'-lantern on the porch. I wouldn't have stopped there if Max hadn't insisted. "Come on, it's the last house," Max pleaded, his eyes wide with excitement. Reluctantly, I agreed. I walked with Max to the front door and rang the bell. The sound echoed through the house, but no one answered. Just as we were about to leave, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his 40s. He wore a plain black hoodie, his face shadowed by the porch light. "Trick or treat," Max said eagerly, holding out his bucket. The man stared at us for a moment before stepping aside, revealing a bowl filled with candy on a small table inside the doorway. "Help yourself," he said, his voice low and raspy. Max didn't hesitate. He reached for the candy, and as he did, the man's hand shot out, grabbing my brother's wrist. "You've got a sweet tooth, don't you?" he muttered, his grip tightening. My heart raced. Without thinking, I yanked Max back, breaking the man's hold. We turned and ran, hearing the door slam shut behind us. As we reached the street, Max looked up at me, his eyes wide with fear. "What was that about?" he asked, his voice trembling. I didn't have an answer, but I knew something was wrong. We rushed home, and I tried to shake off the encounter as just another weird Halloween moment. But when Max dumped out his candy on the living room floor, I noticed something strange. Amidst the usual treats was a small, unmarked white envelope. "Where did this come from?" I asked. Max shrugged, clearly shaken by what had happened. I tore open the envelope, revealing a single piece of paper folded inside. As I unfolded it, a chill ran down my spine. Written in red ink were the words, "He likes the taste of fear." My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of it. I looked at Max, who was now crying, the fear in his eyes mirroring my own. That's when I noticed something else, something that made my blood run cold. In the pile of candy, there was a small vial, its contents a dark, viscous liquid. I grabbed the vial, my hands shaking. I didn't know what it was, but I had a terrifying suspicion. I called the police, explaining everything that had happened. They arrived within minutes, taking the vial and the note as evidence. Hours later, we received a call. The liquid in the vial was a potent sedative, enough to knock out an adult within minutes. The note had been written in the man's blood, his fingerprints matching those of a known predator who had disappeared years ago. The police didn't tell us everything, but they said enough to leave us horrified. "We were lucky," they said. "If I hadn't pulled Max away when I did, he might not have made it out of that house." That Halloween changed everything for me. I can't look at Halloween decorations, candy, or even trick-or-treaters without remembering the look in that man's eyes. He wasn't just giving out candy, he was hunting, preying on the innocent. And the worst part, he's still out there, somewhere, waiting for the next Halloween to roll around. Halloween night was supposed to be harmless fun, just candy, costumes, and kids with glowing pumpkin buckets. But when the doorbell rang at 10:47 p.m., long after the last trick-or-treaters had gone to bed, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I opened the door. I had been feeling uneasy all night. Maybe it was the weather, the fog that rolled in around 7 p.m., making the air heavy and damp. Or maybe it was the unusually low turnout of trick-or-treaters. I live in a small suburban neighborhood where Halloween is a big deal, but this year felt off. By 9 p.m., I had almost given up on seeing any more kids and decided to settle in with a horror movie. I had just opened a bottle of wine when the doorbell rang. I checked the time, 10:47 p.m. Who the hell is trick-or-treating this late? I hesitated, but the bell rang again, more insistent this time. The porch light flickered as if struggling to stay on. With a sigh, I set down my glass and made my way to the door, half expecting to see a group of rowdy teenagers playing a prank. But when I opened the door, there was just one kid. He looked to be about 9 or 10, standing alone in the fog, dressed in an old-fashioned costume, something like a vintage clown suit, with faded stripes and oversized buttons. His mask was plain white, featureless, except for 2 black holes where the eyes should be. His costume was a little too big for him, and the way it hung off his small frame made him look almost fragile. "Trick or treat," he said in a voice so soft, it was barely more than a whisper. Something about him made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the way he stood so still, or how the fog seemed to cling to him like a shadow. I forced a smile and reached for the candy bowl, trying to shake off the unease. "You're out pretty late," I said, dropping a few pieces of candy into his outstretched bucket. He didn't reply. just stood there, staring at me through that empty white mask. The silence stretched on, and I started to feel uncomfortable. "All right, well, happy Halloween," I said, moving to close the door. But he didn't leave. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. Then he asked, "Can I come in?" The question caught me off guard. "No, sorry," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "It's pretty late, and I think it's time for you to head home." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, without a word, he turned and walked down the steps, disappearing into the fog. I closed the door, feeling a strange sense of relief. But as I turned back to the living room, I heard the doorbell again. My heart skipped a beat. No one had time to walk away and come back in that short span. I whipped around and looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. I waited, trying to steady my breathing, but the doorbell didn't ring again. I shook my head, chalking it up to my nerves. I went back to my movie, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the front door, half expecting it to ring again. At midnight, I decided to call it a night. I locked up, double-checking the deadbolt, then headed upstairs. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. The back door, the one that led to the patio, was wide open. My stomach dropped. I knew I had locked it earlier. I slowly walked towards it, my mind racing with explanations. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe I'd left it open by accident. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I closed the door, locking it securely, and backed away, trying to make sense of the growing dread in my chest. Then, I heard it, a soft rustling noise, like fabric brushing against the wall. It was coming from the living room. I turned, and there, standing at the base of the stairs, was the boy. His white mask glowed faintly in the darkness, and his small hands clutched the empty candy bucket. I should have run, screamed, done something, anything. But I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. How had he gotten in? The windows were locked, and I'd never heard the door open. "Can I come in?" he asked again, his voice so soft it barely reached my ears. This time, the word sounded more like a threat than a request. I didn't reply. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I could only stare as he took a step forward, and then another, and another. By the time I snapped out of it, he was right in front of me, close enough that I could see my reflection in the black holes of his mask. The stench of damp earth and decay filled my nostrils, making me gag. He reached up slowly, his small hand brushing against my arm. His touch was ice cold, and as his fingers curled around my wrist, I felt a sharp, piercing pain shoot through my hand. I gasped, yanking my arm away, but the pain didn't stop. I looked down, expecting to see blood, but there was nothing, just an empty, searing ache spreading through my arm. He tilted his head again, almost as if he was curious about my reaction. Then, in one swift motion, he turned and bolted towards the open patio door. I chased after him, adrenaline surging through me, but by the time I reached the door, he was gone, vanished into the night, swallowed by the fog. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring out into the darkness, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, I woke up with a throbbing pain in my wrist. When I looked at it, I saw a small, crescent-shaped scar right where the boy had touched me. I never told anyone about that night. What could I say? That I'd let some strange kid into my house, and he'd left me with a scar that I couldn't explain. Who would believe that? But every year, on Halloween night, the scar burns like fire. And every year, when the doorbell rings, I hesitate. I know it's just kids looking for candy, but I can't help it. I remember the boy, the cold touch of his hand, and the way he looked at me through that empty white mask. And I wonder, what if he comes back? I've always been the type of person who loves Halloween. The costumes, the decorations, and the thrill of a good scare, it was all part of the fun. But last year, something happened that changed the way I see Halloween forever. It's a night I'll never forget, and one that I'll never fully recover from. It started out as a typical Halloween. My friends and I decided to visit a different neighborhood this time, one known for going all out with decorations and full-sized candy bars. We were in our 20s, but the lure of Halloween had never faded for us. We put on our costumes and hit the streets, laughing and joking as we moved from house to house. The night was going great. The neighborhood was everything we hoped it would be, houses decked out in elaborate displays, and the candy haul was impressive. But then, as we were about to head home, we noticed something strange. There was a house at the end of the street, tucked away behind overgrown bushes. It had no decorations, no lights, and no signs of life. But what caught our attention was the group of kids that were walking up to it, knocking on the door as if it was just another house on their route. "Should we check it out?" my friend Sarah asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. I hesitated. There was something off about the place, but I didn't want to be the one to back out. "Why not?" I said, trying to sound confident. We watched as the kids knocked on the door, but no one answered. They stood there for a moment, then turned around, looking disappointed. As they walked away, we decided to take our turn. We approached the house, our footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. The air felt colder as we got closer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We reached the front door, and I knocked, the sound echoing through the stillness. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, just as we were about to leave, the door creaked open. But instead of a person, there was just darkness inside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No response. Just silence. "Let's go," Sarah whispered, tugging at my sleeve. But I was frozen, staring into the black void beyond the door. That's when I noticed it. Inside the doorway, barely visible in the darkness, was a small table with a single bowl of candy. It was the only thing in the entire house that seemed out of place, like it didn't belong there. "Look," I said, pointing to the bowl. We all stepped closer, peering inside. The bowl was filled with candies, all individually wrapped, but none of them had any labels. They were just plain, unmarked wrappers. "Let's just take one and go," my other friend, Matt, said, already reaching for a piece. As soon as his hand touched the candy, the door slammed shut behind us. We all jumped, our hearts racing. "Okay, this isn't funny," Sarah said, her voice shaky. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. Panic started to set in. We were trapped inside this house, with no idea who, or what, had closed the door. We turned around, scanning the room for another way out, but the house was completely empty. There was no furniture, no decorations, nothing except that bowl of candy. "Let's just leave the candy and try the back door," I suggested, trying to stay calm. But as we turned to leave, we heard a faint noise. It was coming from the bowl. A soft, rhythmic ticking sound, like a clock counting down. "What the hell is that?" Matt whispered, his face pale. Without thinking, I reached into the bowl, grabbed the candy Matt had touched, and unwrapped it. Inside was a small, round device with a timer. The numbers on the display were counting down. "Get out. Now." I screamed, throwing the device across the room. We bolted for the back door, and this time, it opened. We ran out of the house, not stopping until we were halfway down the street. Behind us, the house stood silent and dark, as if nothing had happened. We didn't look back. We didn't stop running until we were far away from that neighborhood. When we finally caught our breath, we realized how close we had come to something truly horrifying. We never reported the house to the police. We didn't know how to explain what had happened, and we weren't sure anyone would believe us. But from that night on, we never went trick-or-treating again. Halloween used to be my favorite holiday. Now, it's a night I dread, a reminder that some things are better left undiscovered. There are places in this world that hide in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true nature. And sometimes, all it takes is a single knock on the wrong door. It was a typical Halloween night in our quiet suburban neighborhood. The streets were alive with children in costumes, parents chatting on the sidewalks, and houses glowing with jack-o'-lanterns. I was in my mid-20s, newly moved in with my girlfriend, Lisa, and we decided to stay in, handing out candy instead of joining the neighborhood party. We'd set up a small table on our porch, decorated with fake cobwebs and a bowl filled to the brim with assorted candy. It was our first Halloween in our new home, and we wanted to make a good impression. The evening had gone smoothly, excited kids, polite parents, and the occasional compliment on our decorations. But as the night wore on, the crowd started to thin out, and the atmosphere grew eerily quiet. It was around 9 p.m. when the last group of kids came by. After that, the streets were nearly empty, with only a few stragglers making their way home. Lisa and I decided to call it a night and started packing up. Just as I was about to close the door, I noticed someone standing at the edge of our driveway. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing an old-fashioned, worn-out mask that covered his entire face. The mask was one of those generic ones you might find in a dollar store, pale, expressionless, with black holes for eyes. He was dressed in dark clothes, blending into the shadows, and he didn't move or say anything. He just stood there, staring at us. "Hey, can I help you?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't respond. He just tilted his head slightly, as if studying us. Lisa stepped beside me, glancing nervously at the man. "Maybe he's lost," she whispered. I wasn't so sure. There was something unsettling about the way he just stood there, not saying a word. The longer he stayed silent, the more the tension built. "Look, if you want candy, we've got some left," I said, grabbing a handful from the bowl and holding it out. The man didn't move. He just kept staring. "Okay, this is getting weird," Lisa muttered, backing into the house. "Let's just close the door." I nodded, but as I turned to go inside, the man suddenly took a step forward. I froze, unsure of what to do. He took another step, then another, until he was standing at the bottom of our porch steps. He was close enough now that I could see the mask was dirty, smudged with something that looked like dried blood. "Seriously, man, you need to leave," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The man slowly reached into his pocket, pulling out a small piece of paper. He held it out to me, waiting. I hesitated, but something told me to take it. I reached out, snatching the paper from his hand, and quickly unfolded it. My heart skipped a beat when I read the words scribbled in red ink, "Your girlfriend is beautiful." My blood ran cold. I looked up at the man, who was now standing motionless again, his dark eyes boring into mine through the mask. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, but the man didn't answer. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the night as silently as he had appeared. Lisa grabbed my arm, her voice shaking. "We need to call the police." I nodded, but before I could move, the doorbell rang. The sound made us both jump. I turned back to the door, expecting to see the man again, but when I opened it, there was no one there. Just the empty street and a small package sitting on our welcome mat. I picked it up cautiously, noticing that it was wrapped in the same kind of cheap paper as the note. I didn't want to open it, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a photograph, a picture of Lisa and me sitting on our porch earlier that evening, handing out candy. The angle of the photo suggested it had been taken from just across the street, hidden in the bushes. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked at Lisa, her face pale with fear. How long has he been watching us? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that someone had been watching us, someone who had come dangerously close. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no trace of the man. They searched the area and questioned our neighbors, but no one had seen anything. That night, Lisa and I didn't sleep. We sat in the living room, all the lights on, listening to every creak and rustle, too scared to close our eyes. The police told us to stay vigilant, but there wasn't much they could do. The man had left no evidence, no clues, just the haunting memory of his presence and the strange knowledge that he had been watching us. Halloween used to be my favorite holiday, but now it's a night I dread. Every time I see someone in a mask, I remember the way he stood there, silent and unblinking, as if he knew something we didn't. Halloween had always been my favorite time of year, but last year, something bad happened. It was supposed to be just another night of fun, but it turned into something far more strange, something I'm still trying to wrap my head around. It started with a dare. My friends and I were hanging out at my apartment, watching horror movies and eating way too much candy, when someone brought up the old, abandoned house on Elm Street. The house had been empty for years, but there were rumors about why it had been left to decay. Some said the last owner had disappeared without a trace. Others claimed they could hear strange noises coming from the basement at night. Most people just avoided it. But we were young, and we wanted a thrill. Let's go check it out, my friend Jake suggested, grinning like a kid with a secret. I should have said no. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay put, but I didn't want to be the one to back down. So I agreed, and before I knew it, we were all piling into my car, heading towards Elm Street. The house looked even creepier in person. It was a 2-story structure, covered in ivy and with windows that seemed to stare back at us like dark, hollow eyes. The front door was slightly ajar, as if inviting us in. "This is a bad idea," my girlfriend, Sarah, whispered, clutching my arm. "Just a quick look," I reassured her, though I didn't really believe it myself. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The air was musty, heavy with the scent of mold and decay. The floorboards creaked under our weight as we made our way through the living room, where old, dusty furniture was draped in sheets. It felt like the house was frozen in time, like its owner had left in a hurry and never returned. But it was the basement that drew us in. The door to it was at the end of a narrow hallway, almost hidden behind a broken piece of wallpaper. Jake found it first, and before I could stop him, he had yanked it open. A set of rickety wooden stairs led down into the pitch-black void below. "Let's see what's down there," he said, already descending the steps. I hesitated, but the others were already following him, so I had no choice but to join them. The basement was cold, colder than it had any right to be, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with old tools, jars, and what looked like forgotten memories. But that wasn't what caught my attention. In the center of the room was a large, heavy wooden table, stained dark with something that looked like oil, but smelled metallic, like iron. Above the table, hanging from the ceiling, was a single, dim light bulb, casting eerie shadows across the room. On the table lay a set of old, rusty chains, and nearby, there was a pair of heavy metal handcuffs attached to the wall. "What the hell is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, we heard it, a faint sound, almost like a whimper, coming from behind a large, metal door at the far end of the basement. The door looked out of place, as if it had been installed long after the house was built. It was thick, with a small, barred window at the top. "Someone's in there," Jake said, his eyes wide with excitement. "Don't," I warned, but it was too late. Jake was already moving towards the door, reaching for the handle. The door creaked open, and the smell hit us first, a foul, putrid stench that made my stomach churn. We shined our flashlights inside, and that's when we saw her. A woman, huddled in the corner, her clothes torn and dirty, her face pale and gaunt. She looked up at us with hollow eyes, eyes that had seen things no one should ever have to see. Her wrists and ankles were bruised and bloody, shackled to the wall by heavy chains. "Oh my God," Sarah gasped, rushing forward to help her. But as she got closer, the woman's expression changed. Her hollow eyes suddenly filled with terror, and she started to scream, a guttural, animalistic sound that echoed off the walls. "Get away from her," I shouted, grabbing Sarah and pulling her back. The woman thrashed against her chains, her screams growing louder, more desperate. But it wasn't us she was afraid of. It was something else, something in the basement with us. I turned to Jake, who was still standing frozen by the door, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, shifting in the corner of the room, darker than the rest of the basement. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it was watching us. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. But as I turned to leave, the basement door slammed shut, trapping us inside. The light bulb above the table flickered, casting the room in and out of darkness. The woman's screams grew louder, more frantic, and I could feel the air growing colder, suffocating us. "We have to get out," Sarah screamed, clawing at the door. I grabbed Jake and pulled him towards the stairs, but something grabbed my ankle, yanking me back. I hit the floor hard, my flashlight rolling away, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a figure, tall and thin, looming over me, its face hidden in the shadows. But then it was gone, and the basement was silent. The woman had stopped screaming, and the only sound was the pounding of my own heart. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing Sarah and Jake, and we ran, up the stairs, through the house, and out the front door, not stopping until we were back in the car. We never spoke about what happened in that basement. We drove back in silence, too shaken to say anything. The next day, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a trick, a prank played by someone who knew we'd be stupid enough to enter that house. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was in that basement, something that was waiting for us, something that had been watching us the whole time. And it was only by sheer luck that we made it out alive. We moved out of that neighborhood a few months later, and I haven't been back to Elm Street since. But every Halloween, I can't help but think about that house, about the woman chained in the basement. It was another work shift at the convenience store. A few hours of dealing with costumed teenagers trying to buy beer, and then I'd be home, watching horror movies with my girlfriend. But that night, something strange happened. My shift started at 10 p.m., right as the streets began to fill with trick-or-treaters and the sound of distant fireworks. The store was located on a quiet corner of a residential neighborhood, not too busy, but just enough to keep me occupied. I was the only one working that night. My coworker had called in sick, leaving me to manage the store alone. By midnight, the streets had quieted down, and the store was almost empty. The only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional rustling of candy wrappers as I restocked the shelves. I was counting down the minutes until I could close up and head home when the bell above the door jingled. A man walked in. He was tall, wearing a long, dark coat that seemed out of place for the mild October weather. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hat, but there was something off about him, something that set my nerves on edge. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond. Instead, he slowly walked through the aisles, his footsteps eerily silent. I watched him from behind the counter, every instinct telling me to be cautious. He didn't seem interested in the products. He just walked, his eyes hidden behind the brim of his hat. After what felt like an eternity, he stopped in front of the counter and looked up at me. His eyes, cold and empty, sent a chill down my spine. "Is there something you're looking for?" I asked again, more forcefully this time. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only a hint of something dark, something unsettling. "Just browsing," he finally replied, his voice low and gravelly. "Is it always this quiet around here?" "On Halloween, yeah," I answered, glancing at the clock. Only a few more hours to go. Do you believe in ghosts? He asked suddenly, his voice dropping to a whisper. The question caught me off guard. Not really, I said, trying to shrug it off. Why do you ask? He leaned in closer, his face inches from mine. Because you're about to meet one. Before I could react, he reached into his coat and pulled out an old, leather-bound book. He placed it on the counter, his fingers lingering on the cover. Take a look, he said, his voice barely audible. I hesitated, but something compelled me to open the book. Inside were pages filled with strange symbols, drawings, and what looked like spells. The more I flipped through it, the more uneasy I felt. It was like the book was alive, pulsing with some dark energy. What is this? I asked, my voice shaking. It's a story, he replied, his smile widening. A story about this very night. I looked up at him, my heart racing. What do you mean? He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to a page in the book, where a detailed illustration depicted a man standing alone in a convenience store, surrounded by shadows that seemed to move on their own. The man in the drawing looked just like me. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling. What the hell is this? Who are you? He didn't respond. Instead, he simply turned and walked towards the door. But before he left, he stopped and looked back at me. Happy Halloween, he said, his voice echoing in the empty store. And then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him. I stood there, staring at the spot where he had been, my mind racing. I wanted to believe it was some kind of sick joke, but the book was still there, its presence unnerving. I couldn't bring myself to open it again. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. I kept expecting the man to come back, but he never did. When my replacement finally arrived, I handed over the keys and practically ran out of the store, the book still sitting on the counter, untouched. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the man's words, about the book, about the drawing that looked so much like me. The next day, I went back to the store, determined to figure out what was going on. But when I got there, the book was gone. My coworker had no idea what I was talking about. He said he hadn't seen any book, and there were no records of it in the store. Halloween has always been a busy night for our family. My parents run a small bed and breakfast on the outskirts of town, and every year, we host a Halloween party for the guests who come from all over to experience the haunted history of the area. Our old Victorian house, with its creaky floors and dimly lit hallways, is the perfect backdrop for spooky stories and ghost tours. Last year, the house was packed with guests. My mom had gone all out with the decorations, cobwebs in the corners, fake bats hanging from the ceiling, and flickering jack-o'-lanterns lining the front porch. I was in charge of helping out with the party, making sure everyone had drinks and that the candy bowl stayed full. Everything was going smoothly until about 9 p.m. That's when he showed up. I was standing near the front door, handing out candy to trick-or-treaters, when I noticed a man walking up the driveway. He wasn't wearing a costume, just a plain black coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. Something about him made me uneasy, but I brushed it off. It was Halloween, after all. People were bound to look a little strange. Can I help you? I asked as he approached the door. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past me into the house, his gaze lingering on the guests mingling in the foyer. Finally, he spoke. Is there a room available? His voice was low, almost a whisper. I hesitated. We were fully booked for the night, and it was odd that he'd show up without a reservation. But before I could tell him that, my mom appeared behind me, all smiles as usual. Of course. We always have room for one more, she said, ushering him inside. I shot her a look, but she ignored it. She was always too friendly, too eager to please. The man followed her inside, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Throughout the evening, I kept an eye on him. He didn't socialize with the other guests, didn't participate in the games or the ghost stories. Instead, he sat in a corner of the room, nursing a drink and watching everything with an intensity that made my skin crawl. At around midnight, the party started to wind down, and the guests began retreating to their rooms. My mom handed the man a key and directed him to one of the few rooms we hadn't already given out. He didn't say thank you, just took the key and walked silently up the stairs. I helped my parents clean up after the party, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. Finally, around 1 a.m., I headed up to my own room. As I passed by the room we'd given to the strange man, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. A thin line of light spilled out into the hallway. Curiosity got the better of me. I crept closer, trying to peek inside without being seen. The room was empty, but the light was coming from the bathroom. I could hear the faint sound of water running. "Hello?" I called softly, pushing the door open a little more. No response. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The bathroom door was open just a crack, and I could see steam billowing out. The water was running, but there was no sign of the man. I inched closer, every nerve in my body on high alert. The bathroom was small, just a sink, a toilet, and a clawfoot tub with a shower curtain drawn halfway closed. The water was running from the tub's faucet, filling it with scalding hot water. But what really caught my attention was what was hanging from the shower rod. A black coat and hat, the same ones the man had been wearing. They were soaked, dripping water onto the tile floor. A chill ran down my spine. Where was he? Why would he leave his clothes like that? I reached out to turn off the faucet, and that's when I saw it, something dark swirling in the water, almost like ink. I leaned closer, and the smell hit me. It smelled like metallic, coppery. It was definitely blood. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. I turned to leave, but something made me look at the mirror above the sink. Written in the steam, in letters that looked like they had been traced with a finger, were the words, "Don't look for me." I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I ran to my parents' room, banging on the door until they answered, but when I told them what I'd seen, they just looked at me like I was crazy. My dad went to check the room himself, but when he came back, he said everything was normal. The water was off, the room was empty, and there was no sign of the man or his clothes. The next morning, my mom went through the guest book, trying to figure out who the man was, but there was no record of him. No name, no reservation, nothing. We never saw him again, and I still don't know what happened that night. I was home alone, as I had been every year since my divorce. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find a group of kids dressed in costumes, their parents waiting on the sidewalk. I smiled, dropped candy into their bags, and watched them trot off, laughing and comparing their canvas. But then, something changed. The next time the doorbell rang, it wasn't a group of kids. It was just one boy, standing there alone. He couldn't have been older than 10, with wide brown eyes that were too intense for someone his age. He wore a simple mask, one of those cheap plastic ones with a blank expression, and held out his bag silently. I tried to make small talk, but he just stood there, staring at me through that mask. It was unnerving, but I figured he was just shy or maybe one of those kids who takes Halloween a little too seriously. So, I dropped a few pieces of candy into his bag and watched him walk away, his footsteps slow and deliberate. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang again. I opened it, expecting more kids, but it was the same boy. This time, he was alone on the street. The other trick-or-treaters had moved on. He stood there, bag outstretched, but still said nothing. "Didn't I just see you?" I asked, trying to sound cheerful, but feeling a knot of unease in my stomach. He didn't answer. just stared at me through that mask. I sighed, dropped more candy into his bag, and watched as he walked away. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. He kept coming back. Every few minutes, the doorbell would ring, and there he'd be. Each time, I'd give him candy, and each time, he'd walk away in silence. I started to feel a chill that had nothing to do with the cool October air. There was something wrong with this kid. I decided to ignore him the next time. But when the doorbell rang again, and I looked through the peephole, I saw his face right up against the glass. It startled me so much I almost fell backward. How had he gotten so close without me hearing? I yelled through the door for him to leave, but he just stood there, breathing heavily. I could hear it through the thin wood of the door, deep and labored, like he was struggling with something. Finally, I had enough. I threw open the door, ready to tell him off or call his parents if I had to. But when I stepped outside, the boy was gone. I looked up and down the street, but it was empty, save for a few distant kids and their parents. Shaking my head, I went back inside and locked the door. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I turned off the porch light, hoping to signal that I was done for the night, and settled on the couch, trying to focus on the TV. But the doorbell rang again. I ignored it. Then it rang again, more insistently. I muted the TV, my heart pounding in my chest. The doorbell kept ringing over and over until I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed to the door, flung it open, and there he was. Only this time, he wasn't alone. Standing behind him was a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes. His face was covered by the shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me, cold and calculating. The boy stepped forward, holding out his bag, and the man behind him whispered something I couldn't make out. Fear gripped me, more intense than anything I had ever felt. I tried to close the door, but the boy slammed his hand against it, holding it open with a strength that didn't make sense for someone his size. I screamed for help, but the street was quiet. The man stepped closer, and I realized with horror that he wasn't a stranger. He was the boy's father. I recognized him from the news, a story about a father and son who had gone missing after a series of terrible murders in our town. They had never been found. Until now. The man's face emerged from the shadows, revealing the same blank mask the boy wore. He leaned in, his voice a low, chilling whisper, "We're here for more than candy." I don't remember much of what happened next. I remember the feeling of something sharp against my skin, the cold air rushing in as I fought to get away, and the sound of their footsteps, heavy and relentless as they followed me through my own home. I don't know how I managed to escape, but I did. I ran to a neighbor's house, screaming for help. The police were called, but by the time they arrived, the man and the boy were gone, leaving nothing but an empty street and a trail of blood that wasn't mine. The news reports said they were never found, that they had simply vanished. But I know better. I know they're still out there, waiting for the next Halloween, waiting for the next person who opens their door to a child who shouldn't be alone. Even now, as Halloween approaches, I can't help but feel a cold dread. I've moved since then, changed my life completely, but I can't escape the fear. Every time the doorbell rings, every time a child in a mask stands at my door, I wonder if it's them, if they've come back to finish what they started. I've stopped giving out candy. I've stopped opening my door on Halloween night. Because I know that somewhere out there, they're still looking for their next victim.